Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I am here today at the Rock Island Auction Company. I'm taking a look at some of the guns from their upcoming April of 2016 premiere auction, and I have a totally awesome rifle in front of me. This is a T3E2 Garand rifle, and this is the final trials version of the M1 Garand in .276 Pedersen caliber. And this thing came about that close to being adopted as the U.S. military's standard service rifle in 1932. And it was really only because of one guy that the U.S. ended up retaining the .30-06 cartridge and having a bigger rifle than this instead. So John Garand's work on self-loading rifles started in 1919. At that time, he was working for the Bureau of Standards, and he developed what's called a primer-actuated rifle, where the mechanism was based on this idea that when you fired the rifle, the pressure in the cartridge would actually force the primer back slightly out of its pocket in the head of the case, and you'd have a little piston in the center of the bolt, and when the primer was forced back, that would push this piston, and that piston would operate the rifle. Garand wasn't the only person to come up with this idea. A couple other people did, but it never really turned into anything practical because it would have required a special type of ammunition. The military really liked to stake its primers in place to be really sure that they didn't move. And so adopting a primer-activated rifle would have required a totally different supply of ammunition. Garand realized this, and after a couple years, he abandoned that idea and went to a gas-operated rifle, tapping gas from the end of the barrel. Now, he went through several iterations of this rifle, and by 1929, he had developed pretty much what we see here. A 1929 Garand, which was designated the T3 rifle, would be pretty much recognizable to anyone as a Garand. It'd kind of be a weird-looking Garand, but you'd know what it was, kind of like this. The rifle was tested in the big 1929 rifle trials done by the U.S. Ordnance Department, and it was tested against a bunch of other competitors, including John Pedersen's toggle link delayed blowback rifle, and then a bunch of others. The ZH-29 was in this test, the Thompson auto rifle was in this test, the Heinemann rifle, I believe, was in the test, the Wright rifles weren't there yet, but it was the big trial where they took all the major players and ran a big first test. And the outcome was that two rifles really showed the best results, the Garand and the Pedersen. And so the future rifle trials, with the exception of the Wright, who kind of showed up a little bit late, the future rifle trials were really just competitions between Garand and Pedersen at that point. Now, the T3 rifle from the 1929 trials had a number of problems. It had some feed problems, it had some parts breakage problems, and the Pedersen rifle did as well. And so both designers went back and started tweaking their design. And in Garand's case, he developed the T3E1 variant and then the T3E2. And the E2 was the final version. Mechanically, at a gross level, it was the same as the basic T3, the same basic Garand mechanism, but he'd made some tweaks to resolve those feeding and parts fragility issues. So 20 of these rifles were ordered, and they were going to be used in field testing by both infantry and cavalry units. And the Pedersen rifle, the same thing was done. A small batch was made for field testing. And then it was actually, at this point, it was left up to the troops in the field and then the infantry board and the cavalry board to make their own decision on whether they preferred the Garand or the Pedersen and how they compared to the existing rifles in inventory, the Springfield rifle and the BAR automatic rifle. And as it turned out, both the infantry and the cavalry testing boards preferred the Garand, and they preferred the .276 cartridge over the standard .30-06. The results that they came up with from this field testing were that the .276 cartridge was easier shooting, it had less recoil, it had faster follow-up shots. So interestingly, the .276 had pretty much the same trajectory, the same external ballistics as the .30-06 cartridge. The bullet was a bit lighter. This fired a 125 grain bullet, but the muzzle velocity was pretty much the same. It was about 2,700 feet per second. And so the bullet had less inertia, but it was also more aerodynamic, and the result was basically identical external ballistics. So you didn't have a significant difference there, but you did have reduced recoil, reduced ammunition weight. So what's interesting is the infantry did a series of basically rate of fire and accuracy testing put together. They'd put up targets, and I don't have details on how far the targets were and what size they were, but they ran the same test with the 1903 Springfield, the BAR, this rifle, and the 276 caliber Pedersen rifles. And what they were looking for was the rate of fire, how many aimed shots per minute, and then the number of hits per minute. And then interestingly, they actually calculated the number of hits per pound of ammunition, because that makes a difference when you're comparing, say, a 30-06 Springfield to a 276 Pedersen. And what's important is, given the weight of ammo that you're going to strap onto every infantryman, how many hits can you expect them to make in a given situation with that amount of ammunition? And the Garand was the best rifle by that standard. It was about 15% better in terms of hits per pound of ammo than the Pedersen in 276, and it was also about 15% better than the Pedersen in terms of rate of fire. So this was just a smoother shooting, better handling gun than any of the competitors, both the bolt-action Springfield by a long shot and the 276 Pedersen. Now, a quick note on that cartridge. A lot of people have heard of it, but to put it in some context, as I mentioned, it was a 125 grain bullet at 2,700 feet per second. We don't really have a cartridge today in common use that's really analogous to that. It's less powerful than 308. It's more powerful than the 7.62 by 39 and the 6.8 Remington SPC. The best equivalents are actually the 6.5 Carcano and the 6.5 Japanese cartridge. The 6.5 Grendel is also pretty close. And those cartridges offer plenty of power for actual military effectiveness, but they've got substantially, measurably less recoil, and they weigh less than a full power 30-06 or 8mm Mauser or 308. The Army had actually done its own testing on a series of different cartridges. They looked at the 30 caliber rounds, 276 caliber rounds, and also 256 caliber rounds to determine ballistic effectiveness. And they actually did these tests on live animals. There was a test on pigs, and there was a test on anesthetized goats. And the conclusions that they drew were that the 30-06 was sometimes a little bit better at long range because it had more mass, but at close range, the smaller caliber rounds were actually more effective than the 30-06 because they tend to be unstable, and they created larger wound channels at close range than the standard 30-06 cartridge. So anyway, we're at this point. As of 1932, this rifle has been tested by the infantry and tested by the cavalry. The reports are in, and the semi-automatic rifle board, having gotten their assessments from the troops in the field, now it's time for them to write a final report and make a recommendation to submit to the General Ordnance Department on what rifle should be adopted. And they put together a report that is very complimentary of the 276 caliber Garand, this exact rifle, in fact, and they say that these ought to be adopted. Now, it's interesting that they recognized defects in this rifle at the time, and they're the same things that people still mention to this day as being problems with the M1. Specifically, they mentioned that the back of the receiver was open to the ingress of dirt when the bolt was closed. The operating rod was also exposed and open to dirt. The stock, because of the way the Garand disassembles, where you pull the stock off, the bedding was really not suitable to particularly good accuracy. And they actually toyed with the idea of recommending that the Army should get rid of this cool disassembly feature in preference for having the stock screwed into the action to improve the accuracy. To this day, that's one of the problems with the M1 in a high-power competition field. You have to really put a lot of work into bedding the stock, and after you shoot 1,000 or 2,000 rounds, that's all come loose and has to be redone if you want to really keep the gun super accurate. And they also noted the issue of having this end block clip that couldn't be topped up. And there was also some talk of maybe suggesting that they move to a fixed 10-round internal magazine that was fed by 2 Springfield stripper clips. It appears at the time the Army preferred the end block clip because it was a lot easier to train soldiers on, and it was simpler to use than stripper clips, which are notoriously kind of finicky. However, all of these problems were considered not significant enough to detract, to cause the rifle to not be adopted. Everything's going to have some sort of little issues. These weren't significant enough to hinder the rifle in general. So they put together this report, and they say we should adopt this rifle, and we should start by spending basically our whole $170,000 development budget to tool up and make the first batch of these guns. And they sent that report off, and it never got to the Ordnance Department. Because before it was received, or before it was formally sent, I suppose, General MacArthur weighed in. MacArthur was the chief of staff of the Army at the time, so head honcho of the Army, and he sent down a memo through one of his adjutant generals basically saying that this whole 276 idea is not going to go anywhere. We have a ton of 30-06 already stockpiled, and to a change to the 276 would cause a lot of logistical issues. For one thing, it'd be a new cartridge to adopt, and you'd have to be supplying both it and 30-06 because, of course, the Army has machine guns and the BAR all in 30-06 caliber. In an ideal world, those guns would have been redesigned to use the new cartridge, but the Army had nowhere near the kind of financial resources to actually do that. If they adopted 276, it would be for the new rifles only, and the support weapons like the BAR and the model of 1919 machine gun would stay in 30-06 caliber. And for those reasons, MacArthur basically said, you guys need to stop messing around with 276. You haven't put enough time into developing a 30-06 semi-auto rifle. You need to do that instead. That's it. That's what I say. That's what will happen. End of story. Now, the Ordnance Department had been experimenting with a 30-06 self-loading rifle, and they'd had a lot of trouble getting one that could work that was within the weight limit that they'd set, which was 8 3/4 pounds. Simply, the 30-06 was a fairly high-pressure round, and they had trouble getting rifles that were light enough to meet the requirements, that were also strong enough to survive an endurance test without breaking a lot of parts. They had the foresight, and Garand in particular had some foresight in this area, and kind of suspected something like this might happen. So the Ordnance Department had been developing in parallel a 30 caliber version of the M1. And so when this note from MacArthur came down saying the 276 project is over, this kind of solidified the victory of the M1, of the Garand, over the Pedersen rifle. Because at this point, Pedersen had considered his contract kind of in the bag, and that, it was a sure thing, and he'd left and gone to England, where the Vickers company was going to tool up to make his rifles commercially, and he was demonstrating them to the British government and also to some other countries. And so he wasn't around to react to this change in requirements. While at the same time, John Garand already had a prototype version of the M1, of the Garand rifle, in 30-06. Now, it had some, as of 1932, the most recent test they had done, the rifle had broken a bolt, and so they had to fit a new bolt. But when it comes down that MacArthur dictates 30 caliber, the Garand is almost ready in 30 caliber. And it's not that much trouble for them to go back, finish it, finalize it, and then because they've been finalizing and perfecting the 276 rifle, they know what they need to do in the 30 caliber rifle, and the 30 caliber M1 is pretty quickly available and gets adopted. At that point, the Ordnance Board knew that they liked the mechanism, they knew that it worked, the whole system was good, and all they needed to do was scale it up slightly from 276 to 30 caliber. And that is how we ended up with the 30 caliber M1 Garand. Now, there are a number of differences to this rifle compared to the regular Garand, so I think we should bring the camera in closer and take a look at those, because it's not very often that you get a chance to dig inside the guts of one of the 20 T3E2 rifles that was ever made. All right, let's start with just a quick comparison between the T3E2 and a standard general issue M1 rifle. The weight difference is right at about 3/4 pounds. I actually weighed these two rifles on the same scale, and the M1 came out at 9.8 pounds and the T3E2 at 9.0 pounds. So you get about 12, maybe 13 ounces lighter of a rifle. And over here at the muzzle, we have somewhere between an inch and maybe an inch and a half shorter for the T3E2. Now that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but the balance difference in these rifles is pretty substantial. I'll tell you what, the T3 really doesn't feel like a 9-pound rifle. It feels substantially lighter and handier in the hands than the full-size M1. Now, you have a capacity advantage in the T3 rifle as well. The M1, because it was scaled up and the cartridges were bigger, the M1 of course holds 8 rounds in its standard clip. The T3E2 has a 10-round clip. So you get 2 extra cartridges along with your 3/4 of a pound weight reduction. And of course the cartridges are all lighter. So that's the basic set of advantages you get with the smaller caliber rifle. Now, all the mechanics are pretty much the same. You can see the sights are the same configuration, the bolt handle is the same. The safety looks a little different on the early rifle, but it operates the same way. And the muzzle end. Now, the T3 rifle was still a gas trap, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. So the muzzle looks a little bit different than the standard M1. But other than that, very, very similar rifles. So let's go ahead and pull this apart and take a look at its internals. So we have our standard rotating bolt. Bolt opens, locks open, of course. When you insert a clip, you push down on that follower, bolt closes. I tell you what, this is an extremely smooth, nicely operating rifle. It disassembles the same way as the standard M1. We have the trigger guard is connected to the magazine well and the trigger fire control assembly. So we're going to pull the trigger guard down. That's a little tight, but there it goes. Now, once this is unlocked, then I actually pull the stock down out of the action. So there's our first basic, small, basic difference between this and the final M1. In the final M1, the whole trigger assembly comes out as part of your disassembly. On this, the trigger assembly stays in place in the action. It can be removed, but it's not removed for the standard field stripping. So we end up with our stock assembly and our action, barreled action and receiver assembly. So fire control group in here is basically the same as the final M1, so we're going to go ahead and leave that alone for the time being. And let's focus on this. Now, like an M1, the first thing I'm going to do is remove the recoil spring assembly. That recoil spring is housed in the operating rod itself, just like an M1. So I take this tab, pull it back. This little U-shaped hook pushes on here, and so that allows the main spring, the recoil spring, to also act as the feed spring. We have this long, floppy mainspring, just like an M1. Now that the recoil spring is out, we have no tension on our feed components here, and we can pull the bolt handle back. This is a little bit of a cleaner disassembly than the standard M1. There's a notch cut right here in the op rod track, and we just line that up with the tab on the op rod, lift it out. So once we've got this out of the track, we bring it back here, and it just lifts cleanly out of the gun. Now that that's out, we can go ahead and take the bolt out. To do that, we're just going to bring it forward and then lift it up and out of the action. And there we have our field stripped T3E2 Garand. All right, one thing I want to make a point of, like I said, there are a number of changes between this rifle and the 30-06. One of them that's somewhat significant is that the barrel and the chamber area on the T3 rifle are smaller in diameter because the cartridge is smaller and the cartridge is lower pressure. And that allows the operating rod on the T3 to be totally straight, where on the M1 Garand, there's a bend, a dogleg in this op rod because it has a much thicker barrel back here at the chamber, and so the op rod has to start lower and then it has to come up to be right underneath at the muzzle end. So that dog-legged op rod was one of the trickier parts of tooling up to actually build the M1, was figuring out how to get tooling to effectively and efficiently and accurately form that bend in the op rod. It also was permanently kind of a weak point in the design, because anytime you've got a bend like that, if you have a lot of overpressure ammo, that's a place where the whole op rod's going to bend. This rifle, having a straight linear op rod, doesn't have that sort of compromised strength. This is a stronger piece to begin with. As I mentioned earlier, this is a gas trap style of rifle, which means that there is not a gas port drilled in the muzzle. Instead, the barrel actually ends here, and then you have a slightly larger diameter unrifled section just ahead of the actual crown of the gun. And gas comes out the muzzle and it hits this expansion chamber, goes through down into here, where it then pushes on the face of the gas piston. The benefit to this at the time was that you didn't drill a hole in the rifle, in the barrel. It was thought that that would adversely affect the rifling, that it would wear, and cause problems. And those concerns were technically correct, but not really practically applicable. Now that we have a lot more experience with rifles with gas ports, we know that it's really, those problems don't cause significant issues. So this gas trap system was retained on the .30 caliber M1s, and this is the system that was used when the M1 was formally adopted by the US military. And it was only shortly after the rifle was adopted and put into production that this was changed to a standard drilled gas port in the barrel. So the downside to this gas trap system, what they didn't adequately consider at the time, was because it has a larger expansion chamber, what happens is the volume of gas obviously expands, and the laws of thermodynamics require that when it expands, it cools down. And that cooling effect deposited a lot more carbon and fouling in this area of the gun than it would if you had a small diameter gas port where the gas stayed very hot as it was going through the gas port. So that tendency to foul too quickly was what led them to replace the gas trap system with a standard gas port system on all of the Garands. One interesting little quick note here, if you are a Garand nerd sort of person, you will know that the early M1 op rods had this square connection between this leg and the base of the op rod. And that was modified fairly quickly with a radius cut because it was prone to cracking. It's interesting to note that on the T3, we already have a rounded connection right there. They don't have a square cut. So I don't know the exact history of that square cut on the final M1, but it's interesting to note that the experimental models before it didn't have that potential fault. Interesting. So in general, I personally really think that the Army made the wrong decision in the long term by rejecting the 276. Ultimately, we've kind of come full circle back to that in some ways with the 6.8 cartridge. It's just slightly weaker than the 276. Had they adopted the 276, and had they been willing to use it in some of the other guns in the US military at the time, I really think they would have avoided, this would have avoided the 308 cartridge ever being developed. It then would have avoided probably the 223 cartridge being adopted or delayed it for a while, because this is a pretty darn good round, and it's more controllable, presumably would be more controllable in full auto than the 308. Maybe we don't have to get a new cartridge as small as 223. If you consider what the BAR would have been if you scaled it down to 276, you could probably get that down to something like 14, 15 pounds and have a much better gun overall. Maybe increase the magazine capacity from 20 to 25 at the same time. The 1919 could have been left in 30-06, or it could have been scaled down. You could have ended up with a program much like the Soviet bloc had, where they had the 7.62 by 39 rifle cartridge, and then they had the 7.62 by 54 machine gun cartridge. And it didn't seem to cause that much logistical trouble for them. Maybe it wouldn't have been that big a deal for the United States. Ultimately, of course, we'll never know, because it's history and it's already done and we can't undo it. But I think this is a fascinating what-if scenario that really came that close to actually happening. So, as I mentioned, there were 20 of these rifles that were originally made, and if you'd like to own this one, kind of a once in a very long while chance to own a really cool piece of American military developmental history, well, it is coming up for sale here at Rock Island. So if you take a look at the link in the description text below, you'll find Rock Island's catalog page on this rifle. You can check out their pictures and their provenance and their technical description. And if you just decide you really need to have it, you can either come here to Rock Island and participate in the auction at the end of April, or place an online bid right through the website. Thanks for watching. Better hurry. Camera's on, man. It's going.
You're gonna run out of
The
space.
time is ticking. I only have a gazillion gigs left.
I think it's only days left.
Yeah.
All right.